Well, good morning, everybody. Sorry we're late. A little bit of technological problem going on, but we're live now. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us for our All About Birds talk today. We're going to be talking about some of my favorite kind of birds that live here at the aquarium. They're the shorebirds. Now, you can do just like every time, text us questions. If you would like to help participate today, you can text questions into this number right here, 562-286-1838, and Luke will help answer some of them. I'll answer some of them on the air. Dana is helping control the computer behind the scenes. So we're all going to help you learn about birds. So what do we already know about birds? While you're thinking about birds, another thing to remember, even if you're not watching live, you can still give us questions at live@lbaop.org. All right. Did you think about it? What do you know about birds? They do have feathers. All right, so they have feathers. They have a beak or a bill. Do they all fly? The birds we were watching right when we started, they definitely don't fly in the air, but it looks like they fly underwater. So they all have wings, but they don't all fly. Okay. What else is the same between all the birds? There's a lot of things that are the same, but those are kind of the big ones. Birds vary in size and shape and a lot of different habitats and behaviors all over the place. There's a huge variety of birds. Well, we're going to talk about some of the birds that migrate or live here throughout the year. Now, what is a migration? Migration is when an animal or thing moves from one spot really far away to another spot for a multitude of reasons. Could be finding resources like food or a mate. It could be seasonal changes to stay in a certain temperature so that they don't get too warm or too cold. In some cases, they don't migrate at all. They just stay in one area throughout the entire year. So let's take a look at some birds. We can go back to our penguin camera and let's make some quick observations about the penguins. Because they're birds, they're just very different from birds we see in our backyard or birds we see at the wetlands. So let's take a look at what the penguins are doing. What's this penguin doing? Are you sneaking into somebody else's home, penguin? Sometimes they do. But they have a very stout, rounded body. Now, if you ever watched one of our Draw With Us activities, Emily was telling you how to draw a penguin. It's kind of like a bowling pin with arms. And you can see, we're not controlling the zoom on that, but that's kind of cool. They're zooming in our penguin friend right here. But, oh, no, don't go away. These wings, these wings are their wings. They have all the same bone structures as other penguins. Penguins are also not as agile on land. You can see that. But they have big rounded bodies. They have very thick feet. And those wings have very small feathers on them to allow them to swim underwater. They don't really have the feathers that really allow them to swim in, or, well, don't allow them to fly in the air. So flight feathers are very special feathers. They really have this right structure and size to allow the bird to get lift or to glide in some cases too. And some birds have really specialized feathers, like owls have really specialized feathers that allow them to very quietly just glide through the air so they can grab their prey. If you ever get to see a video of an owl trying to collect its prey, they're not flapping their wings a lot. They will leave the trees and they'll just kind of slowly glide down and grab their food. And then once they've grabbed their food, they can pick back up. There's a couple more penguins right there. Can't see you. What are you doing? Now, penguins also have a very thick beak. And that beak, like all birds, is to help them feed. So this beak on a Magellanic penguin is very thick. There are other penguins that have very thin beaks that allow them to eat smaller food. So the size of the beak is really going to help with that. Big beaks help with big food. Now, these king penguins have a very long bill. That is to help them grab bigger fish. If they have a big bill, or big beak, if they have a really big beak, they can grab big fish. If they have a smaller beak, they're going to be grabbing smaller things like plankton. Now, I think we might be having some mic problems. I think somebody texted in. We're checking on it.
but I'm getting this. Well, keep talking, Stewie.
All right, so we're taking a look at it.
I'm going to ask him if, yeah, that is really high. Bring it down a little bit.
Now, this is the Magellanic Penguin skull. Let's take a look at an Adelie Penguin real quick. And the Adelie Penguin has a very small beak. Now, it's harder to see in this picture because the Adelie's face is looking straight at the camera, so it's a little tougher, but let's take a look at the Adelie real quick. They're actually really cute, very feisty birds, but they have a very small beak compared to a Magellanic beak, and this means they're going to be eating smaller food. Well, this is the same kind of rule with other birds. The beak tells you a lot about what they're going to eat. So they can either dig in the sand, they can catch big food. You could be like a puffin and grab large amounts of fish all at once in your beak and take it up to the surface to eat. So the beak shape tells you a lot about what birds are eating. Now take a look at this Adelie's feet real quick too. Remember we said that the penguins have really stout feet? So they have thick feet to help steer in the water. So when they're swimming, those feet help give them left or right directions. And then they're flapping their wings to swim. Now, on some birds, the feet will get darker as they're out in the sun more and as they're aging, because it's like we get more tan if we're out in the sun more often. Their feet will darken in color the more often they're exposed to sunlight. So you can kind of, it's not a perfect rule, but you can kind of tell on our Magellanic penguins if they've been out in the sun a lot more, or if they are a little bit older, they might have darker feet. And then, again, that's not a rule that it's always that way. We don't measure the darkness of their feet to equal age, but it's one of the things that we can observe happening in the birds. Okay, well, let's take a look at some shorebirds. And how are they very different from a penguin? Remember, kind of like a bowling pin shape with feet and wings. Let's see. Who's this? This is the black-necked stilt. What is a difference you notice? There's some similarities, but what is a difference you automatically can notice about a stilt? Well, they still have a rounded body. They're still aerodynamic or hydrodynamic. But what's different? They have these really long legs. And you can kind of see it. It's a little darker in this picture. We might have another picture we can show you. But they have this really long, skinny beak, too. So the black-necked stilt has this long, skinny beak, long, spindly legs. And how does that help it, in its environment, collect food? Well, if you're a stilt, you will be in the water or at the water's edge. And this allows them to not worry about having to swim or float away. They can stand kind of in the water, and their skinny little legs and feet will stick into the water. And then their long beak can do this kind of sewing machine motion where they kind of poke and stab into the water or into the sand to grab their food out of the sand. Other birds will turn things over. So they'll like lift up stuff with their beak to look for food underneath it. Or in some cases, they might have a really long curled beak to help grab their food out of the marshes and the wetlands. So wetland birds have very different bodies than penguins do, even different than like a pelican. I have a skull of a pelican. I think we have a picture of a pelican too. So here's a brown pelican with, I think this is breeding plumage, with the big flower, yellowy flowery cap on the top. So that coloring on their forehead is some of their breeding plumage. So if you look at a pelican, this is their beak. This is their head next to their beak. Well, why would you have such a long beak? What's the point of this? Well, a brown pelican is one of the few pelicans that actually dives in the water the way it does to grab its food. So part of the shape of the beak helps it get into the water, but it also has a lot of skin underneath here. So since this is a model of the beak and the skull, we wouldn't have the skin underneath, and it's a pouch that can fill with water. They'll spit the water out, and they can swallow their food. It'd be a lot of water to swallow if they swallowed the water every time they caught a fish. So the brown pelican, I think, is one of the smaller pelicans, but also one of the few pelicans that dives like it does to get food. In some cases, birds will do what's called plunge diving, which is just like you think of, like dive in the water. And they do that with their wings and their neck. They stick their neck out, and as long as it's out straight, they can dive in the water really cleanly and easily. And then they pull their wings in right at the last second to get into the water. Now, plunge diving is diving. In other cases, they're floating at the surface and then dive into the water. Now, we have a video of some birds swimming around. This is one of our diving bird exhibits. Now, a lot of the birds in the ocean are going to exhibit the same behavior. They will swim through the water And they'll flap their wings just as if they're out in the air. Now, these are puffins and auks, and we have our auklet in this exhibit too. These birds can fly, so they have a similar role as the penguins. They're black and white for camouflage. They can grab fish or krill out of the water. And here we go, bloop. And then they can swim around at the surface too. So they have a body shape that's a little bit different than a penguin. So their neck sticks up. So we're going to use this puffin as an example. Their neck sticks up enough that they can just float around on the surface. And if you look, their feet are really back towards the back of their body. A lot of diving birds have this design in their body so that they can fly, they can walk around, not always the best, but they can still walk around a little bit. And then because their legs are so far back, it helps them kick to swim. Other birds like cormorants, there's actually some flightless cormorants, but there's other birds like a cormorant that have the very similar body type, and they can dive very deep in the water. Now, I think the tufted puffin, like this one, and the horned puffin, I think they dive over 100 feet in the water sometimes to gather food. That's pretty deep to dive when you're a flying bird. That's impressive for that animal to do. All right, we have some questions that came in. Let's see. Let's start over on this side. We have, how long do penguins usually live? Good question, because penguins do vary in lifespan depending on the species, but also depending on if they're cared for by a zoo or aquarium. Now, penguins out in the ocean, I think it's around 10 to 20 years. Here with us, we had a penguin that was almost 30. So our penguin Henry, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, he was a much older penguin. So he was one of my favorites here. He was a big grumpy Gus. And that penguin, he had a long lifespan because here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, we have on-site veterinary care. They get the best food selections of any penguin that, besides their, I mean, others at zoos and aquariums, but not compared to their wild counterparts. And then there's people that monitor them every day. So the caretakers are in the exhibit at least twice a day, if not more often, to clean the exhibit, feed them, take care of the exhibit, make sure it's clean for them. So the caretakers are in there quite often monitoring the penguins too, so they can live a lot longer at a zoo or aquarium. Now, Brandon from Buena Park is asking, what are the ways that they use their beaks, the penguins? I'm glad you asked. Because penguins have a very interesting throat, so their beak is just to catch the food, but their throat is really designed to help hold on to their food. Penguins do have a serrated beak, which means it has like a jagged edge, like a steak knife. But once they catch the food, they have to be able to hold on to it and swallow it. So you can see, this is Paddles, when Paddles was a little younger. You can see these papillae inside the throat. There are like little fingers that are sticking in the throat, and they point down the throat to help keep the food from coming back out. So if they have to swallow the food but not all the water, this keeps the food in their mouth. So the beak is really designed to grab the food, and then they can swallow it. For other birds, like let's say a bird of prey, like a falcon or a hawk, that curved beak helps to tear their food apart so they can take smaller bites of it. So different beak shapes will definitely tell you a lot more about what they do. But for penguins, the beak shape is really just to help grab the food, and then the throat will help keep it in their mouth. How much do they eat in a day, and how much do they weigh? So our Magellanic penguins, I think they weigh around 20 pounds. The number of food items they eat per day varies. So during the beginning of, or right before their molting season, they kind of bulk up a little bit. And that's because during molting season, they're kind of itchy and uncomfortable because they drop all of their outer feathers all in one instance. Not like that, but it's in one like week or 2 weeks in one little season, they'll drop all their outer feathers. They have to regrow all those feathers. Now, I have some penguin feathers we can show you. So I'm going to turn my little side camera on, and we're going to show you some penguin feathers real quick. And the feathers are very different from other feathers. So we'll talk about the feathers a little bit, and then you also asked how much do they eat. And the number of pieces of fish, I think they'll eat like a whole herring. And I think I've seen one eat like 9 to 12 herring in one sitting. I don't know where they put it all because they're only like this tall, and 12 herring is like their size. So that's a lot of food to pack away. But during molting season, right before breeding season, they will kind of bulk up a little bit. All right, here's our specialized camera. Here's my hand. I'm going to darken it a little bit. And here's a couple of feathers from a penguin. Don't worry, we'll zoom in. The air conditioner's actually making them blow around a little bit. Kind of makes me laugh. So their feathers, don't blow away. Wait. Their feathers will, we'll put something over here to try and hold it down. Haha. All right. Their feathers have lots of little branches in them so that when they're overlaying each other, the penguin will stay dry to the skin, but their feathers get wet, and then they'll just shear the water off. They still feel wet. But the cool thing about the puffins is that their feathers are very different. Their feathers, they do put an oil on their feathers just like penguins do, but their feathers look like a car that's been freshly waxed. The water will bead off so they don't really get wet. Their feathers should not get wet, in fact. If their feathers are getting wet, it's probably going to lead to the bird getting hypothermia, which is bad, and that's not going to really help them survive. So penguins have a small blubber layer to help them stay warm, whereas the puffins have the ability to stay completely dry. Their feathers don't even really get wet, so their body is not going to get the same effect from the cold water they dive into. But every bird that you've probably seen will fluff up their feathers a little bit, and they're getting an air layer trapped inside the feathers. Now for penguins, you'll see it come out as they swim through the water. But for the puffins, you'll see the same thing, but it's trapping it for the same purpose, but it's a little bit different because they don't have that blubber layer. So they really rely on this kind of waterproofing effect of their feathers and that air layer trapped inside to keep them from getting wet. Let's take another look at some shorebirds, because we have some really beautiful shorebirds that live here at the aquarium. And one of my favorites is in breeding plumage right now. It's the Avocet. The Avocet has this kind of coppery brown crown over their head, but the other cool thing about them is that their legs are blue, which is just the pigment in their body. It's not that they're cold. Their legs are blue. Now, you can't see their legs here, but I think this is our breeding pair, and this is that coloring we were saying is that they get while they're going to breed. During the rest of the year, these feathers are all white. So penguins only drop their feathers once a year. It's called a catastrophic molt, and that's how they drop their feathers. But other birds will change plumage or coloring on their feathers seasonally. So they'll change their colors repeatedly throughout the year. The puffins and the pigeon guillemot are doing this too. The pigeon guillemot will change to a white and a black color, white from black and black from white. But the puffins, their beak color will actually change a little bit too. So different birds will change coloring or plumage at different times of the year. And the avocets, they're called white avocets, even though they don't look very white now. Remember, that's for their breeding plumage. They have those long, spindly blue legs, and it's for the same purpose. It's so that they can stand kind of in the water and get their food. They have that really long beak, but theirs curls up. So here you can see, not only are they standing on one leg, but their legs are blue. And a common question we get is, why do they tuck one leg up? Why do they do that? It's called thermoregulation. So a lot of times they will be, it's controlling their body temperature by how much of their feet is touching something. So if both of their feet are touching something warm, they might get too warm. So they pick one leg up, and then they won't get too warm. Or the same thing with the cold. If it's too cold, they don't want both feet touching because there's a lot of blood that goes through their feet. They'll pick one up, and it won't get as cold, and they kind of trade. So the reason a lot of birds do this is for thermoregulation, to help control body temperature. We wear a jacket or shorts or short sleeves or what have you to help control our body temperature in the environment around us. Now, this curled bill that you see that we have, or curled beak that they have, really does help them get their food out of the ground. And there's another bird called a white ibis that's a very stout, large beak that goes down, and versus the avocets goes up. Then there's other birds that are like curlews, where their beak does the same thing, a very strong curl at the end. And it all depends on the food that they're eating and where they're trying to get the food from. But let's take another look at a shorebird that does not have a big, long, curly beak. It's called the pie-billed grebe. It's actually one of my friend Alicia's favorite birds here at the aquarium. And they have a very different beak than the avocet and the stilt and the ibis. So let's see, based off of what we know a little bit now about beak shape, if we can kind of guess what the pie-billed grebe is going to be eating based off the shape of its beak. Now, while Dana's grabbing that picture, oh, here we go. I'll get out of the way a little bit. How many penguins or penguin types are there? So there's not really a breed of penguin. There are different species of penguin. There are, as far as I know, 17 described or classified species of penguins. And only a couple are true Antarctic penguins. The rest of them don't breed on Antarctica, so they're not considered an Antarctic penguin. And most of the penguins will never see ice or snow. They live in a very temperate or mild climate, kind of like here in California. Are the stilts related to flamingos? They're related in that they're birds. We actually looked this up because this question came up before too. Is how closely related would they be? Well, they're birds. That's how closely related they are. We looked up where they fall in the branches, and the closest one was just birds. But the reason you might be asking is because you observed that they had really long, skinny legs. Well, great observation, because the flamingo has the longest leg to body size ratio, followed by the black-necked stilt. So even though they're not related at all, they have adapted very similar features because of their habitat. So an adaptation is something that helps an animal survive. And over time, animals develop adaptations based off of their environment, based off of their behaviors, based off of a lot of factors. So if they're both water or shorebirds that need to get food out of shallow water, best to have long legs and a long beak or a long neck. So the flamingo has a really long neck, and they lean over and they'll grab their food that way. Whereas the stilt, remember, is doing that kind of sewing machine motion where it will poke and stab into the sand to grab its food out. All right, let's go back to the grebe. And did we figure out what it might be eating? Well, someone asked what the penguin's favorite food is, and ours is fish. They do love that herring. Other penguins do eat different species of fish or different kinds of krill. But what do you think a bird with a big stout beak like this, so it's not super long, so it doesn't have to dig out from under things, but it has a very robust or thick beak. So what should it be eating? Probably not little tiny things, or it might have something that it has to crack open, so a big strong beak will break open things too. But in their case, they are a diving and swimming bird, so they probably are grabbing stuff out of the water that is big enough that they need a thicker beak to grab. So all of these shorebirds that we were looking at, they do swim, not all dive, but they will swim. And it's kind of funny to watch an avocet or a stilt swim because they have these super long legs that are kicking in the water. It doesn't look like the puffins or the guillemot like we were watching before. It doesn't even look like the ducks, and the ducks are pretty interesting to watch them swim too. All right, another question about penguins. Y'all love penguins. Do penguins have features to protect them from predators? And what would be their predators? Great question. So a lot of animals that are in the ocean have this very specific color pattern with a dark layer on the back and a light layer on their belly. Now this is the emperor penguin. And the emperor penguin has very similar coloring to a king penguin. Remember, still bowling ball shaped. Or not bowling ball, bowling pin shaped. So here we go. Here's the king penguin. And this ability to have a dark layer on the back and a light layer on the belly is what's called counter shading. So sharks have this, a lot of fish have this, the birds have this. And what it is that if they're dark on the back and you look down in the water at them, you can't hardly see them. If they're light on the belly, you look up at them, it's tougher to see them too. So unless you're a huge animal like a whale shark, it's going to be tougher to find the little things that have a light belly as they're swimming above you. So that counter shading helps protect a lot of animals. Now, they don't have a lot of other abilities besides speed. Penguins, even though they can't fly, so they can't escape out of the surface of the water, they are very fast. The Gentoo penguin can swim over 20 miles an hour. Here's a Gentoo penguin. It's the fastest of the penguins. And then our Magellanic penguins, I think, they might average 3 to 5 miles an hour, but I think they can get sprinting up to 10 to 15. So they can actually swim fast if they can breach out of the water. That is beneficial for two reasons. One, so that they can get a little bit of speed and increase their ability to swim quickly through the water. But also, if there's something underneath you and you can breach out of the water a little bit, you can get away from a potential predator. Now, the flying fish can do this too. The flying fish can get out of the water, and it glides with its really wide pectoral fins. So it's getting away from a predator potentially that's in the water. Downside is there might be a bird that will try to catch the flying fish. Okay, so we got all these questions. Where do you get the beaks and skulls from? Good question. They're not our animals. This is a plastic model. There are people that make plastic models of animal skulls and skeletons and parts, even full replicas with feathers and stuff on them. And that's where we purchase them from. We purchase them from people that make replica skulls. Are there any birds that can't swim or fly? Yes. Think of a very long-legged bird. It's a very fast-running bird, and they live in a few parts of the southern hemisphere. emus, and ostriches. They don't fly, and as far as I know, they don't swim either. They're very heavy, dense birds, really long, thick legs to help them run. I think a full-size ostrich male can run over 40 miles an hour. So don't worry about trying to outrun the ostrich. You can't. Sorry. All right. I think we got all the good questions. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. I think we'll give it another minute or so. Wait for Luke to get us any more questions if you like. But are there any penguins in New Zealand? Yes, there are. The littlest penguin lives in New Zealand. Here's a map of all types of penguin ranges. So you'll notice they're all in the southern hemisphere. So they're below this imaginary line we draw in the middle of this map called the equator. The Galapagos Islands are right at the border, but they're all in the southern hemisphere. And there's some that live in New Zealand and Australia. The little blue or fairy penguin is in New Zealand. Now, one of my friends, Katie, she actually had a chance to see a New Zealand penguin sitting on the beach, just hanging out, doing whatever. And this little blue penguin just kind of walks out of the water, shakes off, just kind of looks around, like, yeah, whatever, I'm going to go back in the water. And just walked right back into the water. So they're just animals that do animal things. But this one lives in New Zealand. It seems kind of different and awkward for us because we don't have penguins on the beach here. But it's one of the cool things that lives in the southern hemisphere. It, too, has counter shading, but it has this bluish tint to their feathers on the back instead of black. A smaller bill so that they can eat smaller food, still probably smaller fish, maybe krill. And I think the fairy penguin only stands about 12 inches tall. They're pretty short compared to other penguins. The largest penguin, the emperor penguin, is up to 4 feet tall. So they're huge birds. Good question. Are all the bird bones hollow? So if you've ever heard this before, bird bones are generally hollow, or they have this honeycomb structure inside. So it's not like it's just hollow. It's this air pocket of the inside of the bone to allow them to be lighter weight so they can fly. The penguins that tend to fly less, or the penguins that have to dive in the water, have denser bones. So think of the ostrich. Very dense bones, kind of like ours. It has to survive running around on the ground. Well, the penguins don't have a whole lot of airspace in their bones compared to, let's say, like the avocets. They do fly. They migrate. They have to be able to fly across large distances without using up a whole lot of energy. And so the more flight that they have to do, the less dense their bones are. The more swimming they're going to have to do, the more dense their bones are. That means that would allow them to get into the water, deeper into the water, than if their bones were hollow. So they don't have to use as much energy to dive, but they probably have to use a little bit more energy to fly great distances too. All right, great questions to wrap up the end of our From Penguins to Puffins talk about all about the birds. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're sorry we started a little late. Remember, we had some technical difficulties, but don't forget, there's more programming today. And if you're watching this program when it was not live, don't forget you can still email us questions at live@lbaop.org. We're going to be talking about fish next at 11 o'clock. So stay tuned and have some fun today learning on our Aquarium Online Academy. Thanks, everyone.